It was raining that night, a soft and implacable drizzle that found its way beneath collars and into the conscience. Oxford wears rain well, as if the city had long ago accepted dampness as a condition of its intellect. The colleges glimmered faintly through the mist, and somewhere in St. Luke's an organ was rehearsing the slow descent of a hymn. I remember standing under the carved archway of Brackendale College, watching the lights behind the mullioned windows and thinking, with that peculiar instinct born of long practice, that something within was coming undone. The invitation had arrived, not to me, but through me. The Fellows' annual dinner, the Last Supper, as they half-ironically called it, was one of those academic rites I would have happily ignored had I not been asked by the warden himself to make an appearance. An alumnus had died, a man named Selby, and though the matter was years old, there remained an air of unfinished ceremony about it. I've learned that the dead linger longest where they were most ignored. Inside, the dining hall smelled of port and resignation. 5 fellows and 1 guest I, the intruder, arranged along an oak table polished to ecclesiastical perfection. Candles guttered against the damp air. The portraits of past wardens leaned from their frames with the fatigue of centuries. Someone, perhaps Bryce, made a dry remark about mortality being the one examination everyone passes. It earned the sort of laughter that mistakes intellect for warmth. I listened more than I spoke. Margaret Vane, the literature scholar, possessed the kind of voice that could turn irony into melody. She was quoting A.E. Housman before dessert, and by the time she reached the thoughts that shall not die, her expression had already drifted toward the window. Roke, the theologian, drank steadily, offering theological paradoxes that impressed no one but himself. The warden, Evelyn Dorr, presided with courteous detachment, his smile faint as chalk dust. And then there was Selby's chair left empty, as if his ghost were expected to decline nothing. I watched their eyes flicker toward it between courses. That sort of absence does not simply remain empty. It attracts meaning, like iron to a magnet. There was a rhythm to their glances, the way guilt sometimes manifests as habit. And somewhere between the claret and the coffee, I noticed that 6 glasses had been poured, yet only 5 bore the pale mark of use. The 6th stood full, untasted, directly before Selby's seat. It was Dorr who broke the silence. "We keep it for him," he said. "It's tradition. I believed him, but not entirely. Tradition is the easiest alibi for anything we prefer not to explain." Later, as the port circulated again, Bryce attempted to enliven the mood by recalling some undergraduate prank from the 60s. His story faltered midway through when I asked, too gently perhaps, whether Selby had been part of that particular revelry. Bryce blinked as though seeing me for the first time. "No," he said. "Adrian didn't care for laughter. He was busy pursuing the truth." The last word lingered longer than he intended. When the table broke at last, I stepped out into the quad. The rain had steadied into something finer, not a fall, but a presence, as if the air itself were confessing. I lit a cigarette and listened to the sound of footsteps echoing across the stone. Someone I thought perhaps Eleanor Gray, Selby's former secretary, was hurrying away beneath an umbrella too small for the evening. She passed without a word, the lamplight catching her face only long enough for me to see its weariness. A moment later, the chapel bell began to toll. 10 o'clock, though it might have been midnight in my thoughts. I turned back toward the hall and glimpsed, through the condensation of a window pane, the remaining fellows gathered still, their heads bowed not in prayer, but in memory. The untouched glass glimmered faintly on the table like an unanswered question. Years of inquiry teach you that silence is never neutral. It carries weight, it accrues intent. Something in that hall, in the laughter too easily abandoned, in the misremembered grace Bryce had fumbled through earlier, all of it pressed faintly against the edges of my understanding. A wrong Latin word, a missing glass, a rain-soaked secretary moving quickly through the dark. I didn't know then that the supper would mark the beginning of Selby's second death. but I felt the first tremor of its echo that night as I walked back through the dripping archway and heard the faintest sound, not thunder, not footsteps, but the quiet clink of glass on wood, as if a toast had been offered to a friend too long absent to refuse it. The morning air was damp with the residue of last night's rain, and Oxford smelled of stone and wet parchment, the sort of aroma that presses on memory as much as lungs. I arrived at Brackendale College before Lewis, taking a circuitous route along the narrow cloisters, where the dripping roofs formed a cadence that might have been musical had one been disposed to listen. The halls were empty, save for the faint echo of my own shoes and the distant thrum of a broom against worn flagstones. Selby's death had been declared natural by the attending physician, yet the manner in which the fellows spoke of it, their measured, almost rehearsed tones suggested otherwise. It was the small things that drew an observant mind. A hesitant glance, a too bright smile, a hand lingering on a banister a moment longer than decorum demanded. In Selby's study, I first noticed the glass. 5 of them had been used at dinner. The 6th, placed before the empty chair, stood untouched. Its presence was more eloquent than any of the fellows' words. Lewis arrived, as he always does, with that air of hesitant practicality. He surveyed the room and muttered about accidents, but I saw in the angles of his gaze that he, too, felt a certain tension in the silence. I asked him to follow me back to the dining hall, and together we examined the table, noting the residue of the port and the slight ring of condensation where the glass had stood. A detail, perhaps, but nothing in Oxford escapes observation for long. The fellows gathered, their expressions polite but taut. Bryce adjusted his tie as though physical perfection could cover intellectual guilt. Vane's eyes flicked to the missing glass without acknowledgement, a gesture barely perceptible, yet loaded. Roke, ever serene, sipped his coffee slowly, deliberate, as if time itself might dilute complicity. Dorr, the warden, observed the room with the careful neutrality of a man accustomed to authority, though the shadow beneath his eyes betrayed sleepless nights. I asked, lightly, whether anyone remembered seeing the glass moved during the supper. No, it had not been touched. No one had approached it. There was the faintest hesitation in Bryce's voice as he replied, and I filed it away. Small hesitations have a way of becoming proofs in the quiet intervals of thought. Lewis, as always, watched my eyes more than the fellows, sensing the moment when deduction begins to stir. I turned my attention to the desk. A letter, stamped and opened, lay amidst Selby's papers. The envelope bore no return address. Its contents were gone, yet the paper creased in a way that suggested it had been hastily read, folded, and then removed. The fellows offered explanations, each more evasive than the last. Vane suggested it might be administrative. Dorr that it was of no consequence. Roke that Selby had always been overly cautious with correspondence. And yet I felt the weight of absence, the missing letter, the untouched glass, the silence that wrapped them all. Outside, the rain had ceased but left the air slick and reflective. I glanced at a nearby puddle and caught the inverted spires of the college, reminding me that truths, like reflections, often reveal themselves backward. The fellows' movements through the hallways were precise, as if rehearsed. A slight tilt of Bryce's head, a fingernail tapping on a book spine, an unguarded glance between Vane and Roke. None of these seemed significant in isolation, yet together they hummed with intent. It was in these small inconsistencies that Morse finds purchase. I noted them as one might trace a faint outline of a forgotten poem. The glass, so stubbornly full, was the first line of that poem, and I suspected it would rhyme with a later act, subtle and deliberate. Lewis, sensing my quiet meditation, did not speak. He never does when observation is in its proper rhythm. By the time we left the hall, I understood that the surface explanation of a heart attack, natural causes, was insufficient. There was choreography here. careful and intellectual, a narrative hidden beneath pleasantries and tradition. Somewhere, in the overlooked gesture or the absent letter, the truth waited. And I, as ever, was patient enough to wait with it. The morning light fell through the mullioned windows like the memory of a sermon, pale, uncertain, unwilling to illuminate more than it must. I sat in Selby's old chair, its leather worn to a dull shine, and listened to the faint sound of the college clock marking each quarter hour, as though time were measuring its own reluctance. Brackendale was waking. Somewhere beyond the quad, a kettle hissed, a door closed with academic precision, and the sound of a bicycle chain clicked faintly against the cobbles. They came to me one by one, the fellows, like chapters from a book that no longer quite believed in its author. I had asked them not to prepare statements, though of course they had. Nothing so formal as words on paper. Oxford's kind of confession is written in tone, in how the eyes move toward the window when the truth draws too near. Bryce arrived first. He had the look of a man who feared being misunderstood more than being guilty. His tweed was impeccable, his hair too careful. He spoke of Selby as one might of an opponent long since defeated with respect, but no affection. He insisted that the man had been unwell. I asked him quietly, what illness? And he hesitated. Emotional, perhaps. Paranoid. I could not tell whether he spoke of Selby or of himself. When I mentioned the missing letter, he smiled not with pleasure, but with the small relief of someone who knows a secret and believes it will not be found. Margaret Vane followed, trailing a scent of paper and the faintest echo of disapproval. Her voice was clear, the kind that once lectured on Tennyson but had since learned to keep its rhythm flat. She told me Selby had been difficult, brilliant in that brittle way of men who no longer expect admiration. She used the phrase moral fatigue, and I found myself admiring its precision. When I asked if she loved him, she looked out toward the chapel roof and said only that affection is a dangerous indulgence in a place that rewards restraint. I did not press her. It is unwise to corner the truth when it prefers to walk beside you. Roke, the theologian, entered next, his hands folded as though in benediction. He carried with him the scent of incense and misplaced certainty. He spoke of forgiveness, of mercy, of how Selby had lost his faith in academic purpose. I noticed how his eyes drifted toward the port decanter each time he paused, as though thirst and confession were twin sacraments. When I asked him whether Selby had enemies, he shook his head too quickly. No one here, he said. No one who mattered. Lewis had been taking notes at the far end of the room, his pencil scratching like a cautious conscience. Between interviews, he looked at me and said quietly that they all seemed more rehearsed than grieving. I agreed, though not aloud. There are moments when silence does the heavier lifting. The warden, Dorr, arrived last. Authority hung about him like a heavy gown. He sat opposite me, patient, remote, his hands resting on the arms of the chair as if it were a throne in miniature. Selby was a good man, he said, though he lost his way. I told him that we all lose our way, but not all of us end up dead with a full glass of port untouched beside us. The faint tightening around his mouth was answer enough. After they left, I remained in the study. The air had changed, not heavier exactly, but aware. I noticed that one of Selby's books had been returned to the shelf upside down. Tennyson again. When I pulled it free, a scrap of newsprint fluttered from between the pages. The headline, half torn, read, "College Funds Misused Anonymous Allegations." It seemed an echo of something half-remembered from the night before. Bryce's denial, Vane's restraint, Dorr's composure, each had its place in that unspoken ledger. I turned the clipping over. On the blank reverse, Selby had written a single word in pencil, Grace. Whether it was a name, a prayer, or a final irony, I could not yet tell. But I knew the handwriting, and I knew that in Oxford, grace is rarely unearned. Outside, the rain had returned, soft and unassuming. I stood at the window and watched it gather on the stone like unspoken words. The bells began again, tolling for morning prayers, and I thought not for the first time that confession is a kind of music. Most of the notes are silent. The chapel at Brackendale had the air of a place that remembered being believed in. The candles were already lit when I entered rows of small flames that flickered as though uncertain whether to illuminate or to mourn. Outside, the rain was still clinging to the Gothic stonework, silver threads running down the carved saints who had seen too much of human nature to be moved by any single sin. I did not come for worship. I came because guilt has an odd habit of circling back to music, and the choir at evensong often reveals more truth than a room full of academics. I took my place in the shadows, beside a pillar carved with vines that time had almost erased. The air smelled of wax, damp wool, and something faintly a perfume I couldn't name at first, faintly floral, the sort of scent that lingers long after its wearer has gone. She was there, among the altos, a woman in her middle years. Dark coat, a certain composure that comes from having survived both affection and disappointment. Her voice was not strong, but it carried, weaving through the psalms with that fragile steadiness that betrays someone trying to keep her place in a world that has quietly closed its doors. Later, I would learn her name was Eleanor Gray. At that moment, she was simply the voice that drew my attention from the printed hymn sheet to the living pattern beneath it. After the service, the congregation drifted out through the side door, leaving the echo of their footsteps to fade into the nave. I approached her with what I hoped passed for casual curiosity, remarking on the music, the acoustics, the way the final chord of Abide With Me had trembled slightly sharp. She smiled, a gesture that did not quite reach her eyes, and said the chapel organ was older than any of them cared to admit. There was a precision to her tone, an education quietly worn. I asked if she had known Dr. Selby. Her hands tightened around her music folder, only briefly, but long enough. "Yes," she said. "Once upon a time." We walked together along the cloister, our footsteps merging with the rain's soft applause. She told me she worked now for the bursar figures, ledgers, accounts. I remarked that it must be steady work. She replied that steadiness was overrated, though reliability was not. There was a pause, the kind that invites a change of subject, and I allowed it. She asked if I was one of the new fellows, and I told her, not without irony, that I was only visiting. Her glance said she already knew. When we reached the gate, I asked her too lightly whether Selby had ever mentioned the college trust. She looked at me as if through glass, and for a moment I thought she might lie. Instead, she said softly that some truths are buried for a reason. Then she added, almost to herself, that Selby had been fond of Latin epigrams, though he seldom got them quite right. The misquoted grace at the fellows' dinner returned to me, like a line from a forgotten poem. After she left, I stood in the rain and thought about language and how it conceals as much as it reveals. A scholar who misquotes is either careless or deliberate. Selby had been many things, but not careless. The misquotation, pro vivis et defunctis, rendered incorrectly as pro vivis et defunctum, shifted a plural into a singular, as though he had been praying not for the living and the dead, but for one dead man in particular. I made a note of it, though not in writing. The best deductions live first in the mind, waiting for the moment they choose to surface. The organ resumed behind me, a quiet improvisation that trembled through the damp air. The sound of it followed me across the quadrangle, mingling with the faint smell of wet ivy and candle smoke. Lewis would ask later what I had found, and I would tell him nothing yet, only the sort of nothing that matters. I looked once more toward the chapel window. Inside, the woman was putting away her hymn book, her face half turned toward the light. There was something resolute in the gesture, as though she were folding away not music, but memory. I wondered, as the rain began again, whether she was mourning Selby or only the man she thought he might have been. In Oxford, grief is rarely pure. It comes diluted by intellect, refined by time, and disguised as duty. But sometimes, if you listen closely as I did that night at evensong, you can still hear the note that wavers ever so slightly sharp. It was Lewis who found it, though he didn't realize the weight of it at first. A book of Tennyson, left open on Selby's desk, its pages freckled with the faint, brown ghosts of old raindrops. He mentioned it to me in passing and said there were some underlined letters, perhaps a student's idle habit, and I told him to bring it to the light. That phrase, I remember, struck me as too apt. The light at Brackendale rarely reveals, it softens. I took the volume from him in my room that evening, with the rain beginning again outside, the kind that falls without sound, more like the slow undoing of the air. Selby had underlined single letters in pencil, so faintly that they almost refused to be noticed. It took me a while to see the shape of it, the deliberate unevenness, the rhythm between one stanza and the next. When I read down the page, the message formed slowly. Letter by letter, Bryce lied. Lewis looked at me as if I had conjured something. I told him it meant nothing yet. But it did, of course. It always does. We walked later through the empty quad, our footsteps making that particular sound that wet stone gives when it forgives you for walking on it. I thought about Bryce, his careful diction, the half-second delay before every denial, the slight, imperceptible twitch when the word trust was mentioned. A lie is rarely in the words, it's in the punctuation. Lewis was unconvinced. It could be a coincidence, he said, or the work of a mischievous hand. Oxford, after all, breeds cryptic humor like moss on stone. I told him that humor fades. Intention leaves marks. The book had not been touched for days, maybe longer. The dust along the upper edge was unbroken. Selby's hand, then, his final poem, perhaps. Back in my room, I poured a whiskey Glenfiddich, though I barely tasted it, and stared at the inscription again. Bryce lied. There was something almost childish in its bluntness, a lack of Selby's usual elegance. It was not the message of a man seeking poetic justice, but of one hurried, frightened, perhaps dying. I ran my thumb over the indentation where the pencil had pressed too hard. Beneath the neatness, a tremor. The next morning, I went to find Bryce. His office smelled of polish and decay, the sort of academic fragrance that hides discomfort behind civility. He greeted me with that half-smile academic reserve for policemen's polite condescension wrapped in Latin. He was marking essays, his red pen still uncapped. I asked him about Selby, about their friendship, about the trust. The word changed something in his expression, not fear, precisely, but the awareness of a trap he might already have stepped into. He told me that Selby was a man of many grievances, some justified, most not. He spoke of academic politics, of petty jealousies, of funds misplaced, never misused. His sentences were measured, like someone performing sincerity in a foreign tongue. When I mentioned the book of Tennyson, he laughed a small, dry sound. Adrian was always fond of riddles, he said. You'll find ghosts in every poem if you look hard enough. But I saw the way his eyes moved to the bookshelf, to the very same edition resting there, identical in spine and wear. I noticed, too, the slight discoloration on his finger ink. Not red, but brown, like oxidized residue from an old pen. A man who marks in red, yet bears the mark of another shade. Later, as I walked back through the quadrangle, I thought of the poem Selby had chosen, Tears, Idle Tears. I recalled the line he had underlined most heavily, "O death in life, the days that are no more." I had taught that line once, long ago, before the world became more prosaic. It was about memory, of course, but also confession, the kind that doesn't ask forgiveness. That night, in the quiet of my flat, I opened a crossword in the Times. One of the clues read, "Falsehood exposed in poetic form, 5,4. I filled in the answer before I meant to Bryce lied. Coincidence, yes, but I have never trusted coincidence. Outside, the rain began again, whispering against the window like paper being turned. I thought of Selby's shaking hand, of the word lied, traced so deliberately across a dead poet's lament. The message was meant to accuse, perhaps to absolve. But as I sat in the soft blue light of another Oxford evening, I wondered whether the accusation was aimed outward or inward. There are confessions that hide inside beauty. This one, I suspected, had been written for both. There are certain places in Oxford where time seems to defer to dust, where air itself slows down, heavy with the patience of centuries. The Brackendale College Library was such a place. Even the dust there had a kind of scholarship about it, fine and deliberate, as though laid out in alphabetical order. I remember entering it late in the afternoon, the light already thin and unwilling. I had no reason to expect revelation, only the quiet ache of persistence. But revelation, like guilt, favors the places that pretend to be asleep. Lewis trailed a few steps behind me, his boots making that soft rhythm of untrained reverence. He was the one who had found it, or rather disturbed it, a letter. Slipped into a copy of The Waste Land, left open on the desk by whoever last sought meaning in despair. It was folded, not sealed, as if the sender had wanted it to be found, but not read too easily. The typeface was the old kind used by the college decades ago. The paper itself carried the smell of dust and forgotten ambition. We must speak of the trust. It cannot stay buried. No signature, no date, just that single sentence, the kind that sounds both practical and threatening depending on who reads it. Lewis had thought little of it. He had assumed it was a fragment of old correspondence, one of those administrative relics colleges breed like ivy. But something in the phrasing held the pulse of the present. Buried. The word lodged itself in my mind with the quiet certainty of a clue too honest to disguise itself. We took the letter to the small reading table near the north window, where the rain was beginning to trace slow, deliberate hieroglyphs against the glass. I asked Lewis to check the borrowing record for the book, though I already knew the answer. It had last been taken out by Selby. Of course it had. The man seemed determined to leave a trail of footnotes that led nowhere and everywhere at once. Across the courtyard, the chapel bell tolled the quarter hour, though in that muffled space it sounded like a heartbeat heard through water. I read the letter again. The first word was what troubled me most. Not me. We. That pronoun had the stench of conspiracy. Lewis had gone off to find the porter, leaving me alone with the whispering silence of old pages. I traced my hand along the rows of spines, letting my fingers rest where instinct told them to pause. Selby had written about Eliot once, a short paper on the fragmentary self, filled with observations about voices overlapping within one consciousness. He might have liked the irony of hiding a letter about deception in a book about broken voices. As I turned back, a faint mark on the letter caught my eye. A small smudge, darker than ink, perhaps oil, perhaps blood, though likely neither. It was at the edge of the word trust. Someone had handled it carelessly, or perhaps deliberately. A fingerprint would have been too much to hope for, but the smudge was more eloquent a sign of the human pulse behind the words, the tremor of fear or haste. When Lewis returned, I asked him to bring the college archives ledger. He frowned, knowing what that meant, hours of names, donations, signatures. But investigation, like faith, often begins in tedium. While he fetched it, I looked again through the window toward the Fellows' garden. Rainwater pooled beneath the rose emblem carved in the stone arch sub rosa. Under the rose, I recalled how Selby had once corrected a student's Latin with the absent-minded grace of a man who knew the weight of words. The phrase had lodged itself then, unimportant until now. When Lewis came back, the ledger told its quiet story. The last endowment registered to the trust had been years ago, signed by Dorr and countersigned by Bryce. The same two names that seemed to orbit Selby's death with the precision of planets bound by invisible gravity. The letter trembled slightly in my hand, not from breeze or age, but from something in me that resisted clarity. It cannot stay buried. It was not simply an instruction, it was a confession written to time itself. As we left, the rain had deepened, tapping softly on the ancient glass, like someone trying to be let in. The porter locked the door behind us, his keys jangling in that absent-minded rhythm unique to men who keep other people's secrets for a living. I paused at the threshold, the echo of the wasteland still in my head. These fragments I have shored against my ruins. Selby had known the line by heart. I wondered, not for the first time, whether the ruins he feared were his own or the college's. The bell struck again, deeper now, the sound resonating through, stone and air alike. I pocketed the letter carefully, though it seemed less an artifact than an echo. Something buried had indeed begun to move. The Fellows' garden lay beyond a narrow archway. Most visitors never noticed the sort of entrance that pretended not to exist, as though secrecy were part of its architecture. I went there in the late afternoon, when the mist hung low over the lawns and the last of the magnolia blossoms clung stubbornly to their branches. The rain had stopped, though its ghost still lingered, a thin shimmer across the gravel path. Somewhere behind me, the chapel bell murmured the half-hour, too soft to remind anyone of prayer. I had been thinking about Selby's letter. It cannot stay buried. Words like that are seldom figurative. The human instinct for metaphor dies the moment fear becomes practical. It was the phrase sub rosa, carved discreetly into the stone lintel above the old wine cellar, that drew me back. Under the rose. The place was half forgotten, used now for storage, the key hanging unnoticed among others in the porter's lodge. Lewis had fetched it, grumbling at the damp, though I caught the flicker of curiosity that always betrayed him. The lock resisted for a moment before giving way with a sigh. A smell rose out of old wood, damp earth, and something fainter, like the scent of time gone stale. We descended the narrow steps, the beam of Lewis's torch cutting a path through the dark. The walls' sweated drops of water slid down like the slow punctuation of silence. Against the far wall stood a small iron safe, half hidden by crates of dusty claret. Its door hung slightly ajar, as if someone had once meant to return. Inside was very little, an empty folder, brittle papers, and a single envelope yellowed to the shade of parchment. Its flap was unsealed, its contents gone, save for one photograph. A group of fellows, decades younger, posed around the same dining table I had seen days earlier. Their smiles were the kind Oxford favors, modest, self-aware, the triumph of intellect over sincerity. But what caught my attention was the presence of a seventh figure at the edge, almost cropped from the view of a young woman, standing half in shadow, her expression unreadable. Eleanor Gray. I slipped the photograph into my coat pocket. Lewis, meanwhile, had been reading aloud the faint labels on the old wine bottles, as though hoping one might confess something. When he turned toward me, the beam of his torch fell briefly on the carving above the cellar door, a rose encircled by Latin words too eroded to decipher. But I could make out the last fragment, fiducia. Trust, the same word Selby had underlined in his letter. We replaced everything as we found it. On the way back up, I noticed how the light shifted across the stone, turning the carved rose crimson for an instant before fading back to gray. Lewis asked what I thought it meant. I told him it meant someone had been careful, and care, in matters of guilt, is almost always the final clue. That evening, I visited Eleanor. She lived now in a small flat off Walton Street, a place filled with the quiet order of someone who has learned not to expect visitors. Her window looked out toward the canal, where the water reflected the sodium glow of the lamps like thin trails of fire. She opened the door before I knocked. Perhaps she had been expecting me, or perhaps guilt has its own kind of foresight. We sat without speaking for a while. The air smelled faintly of tea and violets. When I placed the photograph on the table, she didn't look surprised, only tired. She said she had been young then and foolish, though not foolish enough to believe the promises of men who build their lives on footnotes. Selby, Dorr. Bryce's name spoken without bitterness, as though each carried a piece of her long penance. She told me she had once been the secretary to the warden, and later something less official. There had been money, misdirected perhaps, or misused, but never for herself. When she paused, I asked what Selby had wanted from her before he died. Her answer came slowly, wrapped in resignation. "To be forgiven," she said. "For what?" I asked. "For knowing," she replied. That was all. When I left, the night had thickened. The bells from St. Giles drifted through the mist, counting time for those who preferred not to. I walked past the college again, the carved rose invisible now in the darkness, though I knew precisely where it lay, marking the threshold between silence and confession. Lewis would later say we had found nothing of importance. Perhaps he was right, but I have learned that truth in Oxford often hides not in discovery, but in repetition, the same words, the same gestures, looping endlessly beneath the surface. Under the rose, everything endures. There is a peculiar satisfaction in believing one has reached the end of something. The mind, wearied by ambiguity, begins to crave the comfort of conclusion. That evening, I allowed myself to believe we had found it. By then, the pattern seemed too complete, perhaps. The money misdirected through the college trust, the warden's signature on the ledger, Bryce's evasions, Eleanor's silence, each thread leading toward the same tidy noose. It was the kind of case that arranges itself neatly when you're tired enough to stop asking questions. I remember the way the light fell through the window of my flat, a dull amber, the sort of light that forgives flawed reasoning. Strange had called, his voice brisk with bureaucratic relief. "If you're right about Dorr," he said, "we'll have it wrapped by Friday." I told him I was certain. The words came too easily, like a crossword answer one writes before checking the clue. Lewis brought the final piece, or what I mistook for it. A statement from the bursar confirming that Selby had been pressing for an inquiry into the trust just days before his death. There it was motive, opportunity, silence. Dorr had invited him to the supper, perhaps as conciliation, perhaps as precaution. The poison, I reasoned, might have been in the port. It had the elegance of inevitability. We interviewed the warden in his rooms, a place where respectability had been curated like an exhibition. He listened to my theory with a calm so measured it felt rehearsed. He denied nothing, admitted nothing, and when I mentioned the cellar, the rose, the safe, the missing documents, he looked at me with a kind of tired pity. "You want me to have done it," he said. "It would make the world simpler." I told him that simplicity is a virtue only in geometry. He smiled at that, but his eyes remained elsewhere, fixed on the rain crawling down the leaded glass. That night, I walked home through the mist, the kind that erases outlines and leaves only the suggestion of things. The streets were nearly empty. Oxford after rain has a sound all its own, not silence, but the soft breathing of history. I stopped by the Radcliffe camera, the cobbles slick and luminous, and thought how easily one can mistake pattern for truth. The city itself teaches its symmetry, masking decay. In my room, I poured a drink and unfolded Selby's letter once more. It cannot stay buried. The phrase had begun to dull through repetition. Yet something in the rhythm caught me this time, the bluntness of it, the lack of Selby's usual precision. He had been a scholar, a man who weighed words as though each carried moral consequences. And yet here, the language was almost crude. I began to wonder whether he had written it in haste or not at all. The deduction came not as revelation, but as fatigue. I noticed, at the bottom corner of the letter, the faint impression of another page, not a copy, but a pressure mark. Someone had typed over it, perhaps more than once. I tilted it toward the lamplight and saw the ghost of the capital E Eleanor. I went to her the next morning, though the dawn had come reluctantly, wrapped in mist and indecision. She opened the door wearing the same look as before, neither surprise nor fear, only endurance. When I asked her about the letter, she hesitated long enough for truth to bloom and wither between us. She said Selby had dictated it to her, though she had not known why. He had spoken as if rehearsing a confession, not writing one. But when I pressed for details, she turned away. Some things, she said, were meant to stay buried. I left her there, the sound of the canal lapping faintly against the stones. The city was waking, bicycles humming past, the scent of coffee rising from unseen windows. I had my solution, and yet the satisfaction had gone. It fit too easily, closed too neatly, like a door that had been waiting to be shut. Lewis found me later on the steps of the Sheldonian, his face lit by the weak sun. He asked if I was pleased with the result. I told him yes, though my voice lacked conviction. Even then, the echo of another clue stirred somewhere in my mind, a half-remembered misquotation from the supper, a grace altered by a single word. It waited, silent and patient, like the faint ticking of an unsprung clock. False solutions, I've learned, are more dangerous than lies. Lies at least declare their opposition to truth. But a solution to the wrong one offers comfort, and comfort is the most exquisite form of blindness. It was the choir that gave it away, not in what they sang, but in how. The evening rehearsal at Brackendale had always been more ritual than devotion. Yet that night, as their voices rose and fell beneath the vaulting, I heard something that did not quite fit. A word displaced, a vowel held too long. I have learned to trust such things. A small discord is often the echo of a greater one. Lewis had suggested we attend his way of offering patience while I lingered over uncertainty. The case had, in theory, resolved itself, Selby poisoned, Dorr implicated, and Eleanor exiled to silence. The college, eager for quiet, had accepted the version of events I gave them, yet somewhere between acceptance and truth lies the thin air where doubt breathes. The service was Daisy-Rai, an apt choice for a place pretending to forget. The organ murmured, heavy with dust and discipline, while the choir's Latin unfurled in slow lamentation. It was during the fourth verse that I heard a single phrase altered, so slightly that even the chaplain would have missed it. The words should have read confutatis maledictis, flammis acribus addictus, the condemned delivered to the flames, but what reached my ear was confutatis maledictis, flamma acrior sabiditis. A brighter flame burns beneath. That substitution, acria for acribus, shifted the meaning just enough to draw breath into a dead language. I knew that voice. Selby had corrected that very error once, long ago, when I had misread it in a college archive. His correction had been amused, not cruel. He had said, "It's the kind of mistake that reveals more than it hides." After the service, I spoke to the choir master, a diffident man named Meekum, whose spectacles perpetually reflected disappointment. He said the score had been copied from notes Selby himself had provided before his death. I asked when Selby had made the annotations. Meacham thought it was months ago, near the time he had begun to withdraw from the fellowship. The book, he added, had been found in the vestry drawer, the very place Eleanor now kept the choir accounts. Lewis met my gaze, a question unspoken between us. We went together to the vestry, where the smell of candle wax and paper mingled with something faintly chemical, like the residue of ink that had never dried. On the shelf, beside the hymnals, sat the same book of Tennyson I had handled in Selby's rooms. It was open to the poem he had underlined. Tears, idle tears. I turned it gently and saw what I had missed before, faint pencil marks in the margins, forming a pattern not of words, but intervals, musical notation disguised as punctuation. The cipher, when read as pitch, resolves into the same altered phrase from the hymn "A brighter flame burns beneath." Selby had not been silenced by others. He had written his confession into the very fabric of his rituals, a scholar's suicide composed as theology. He had taken the poison himself and left his confession hidden in the music that only he could have composed. Lewis, ever practical, asked why. The question, like all true ones, refused to close. Perhaps it was guilt over the trust, over Eleanor, over the fellowship's decay. Or perhaps it was a kind of final authorship. Scholars die wanting to be understood. Selby, at least, had arranged the terms of his misunderstanding. I looked again at the hymn book. The ink from the altered word acrior had bled faintly onto the facing page, staining the printed grace from the Fellow's Supper pro vivis et defunctum. I traced it lightly. He had changed the plural to the singular. For the living and the dead had become for the living and the dead man. The smallest change and the truest. As we left the chapel, the night pressed close, carrying the faint hum of voices still rehearsing. The moon hung low over the spires, veiled in thin mist. Lewis said something about closure. I told him that cases do not close, they fade, and if one listens long enough, the echoes rearrange themselves into meaning. Later, in my room, I wrote Selby's line across the corner of a crossword I could not finish. A brighter flame burns beneath. It was not an answer. Not quite, but it was enough. The whiskey in my glass caught the lamplight, gold and melancholy. Outside, the city breathed its old refrain footsteps, rain, a single bell somewhere between confession and silence. Oxford keeps its secrets, but sometimes, in the right key, it sings them. They gathered again in the dining hall, though it was not quite a supper this time. The table was shorter, the chairs fewer, and the light from the candelabra less forgiving. Time, when it returns to a place, always finds it smaller than memory. I stood by the mantelpiece, watching the surviving fellows take their accustomed seats, each man and woman diminish slightly, as if the very air of Brackendale had grown tired of them. Dorr sat at the head of the table, pale and formal. Bryce arrived last, his entrance accompanied by the faint rustle of misplaced dignity. Margaret Vane came without her usual armor of irony. Her voice, when she spoke, had thinned into near transparency. The meal itself was perfunctory, a token of civility in a place that had already lost the habit of conversation. Lewis stood by the door, uneasy as ever in academic company. He had wanted me to postpone the meeting, to let the inquest tidy things quietly. But I needed them together once more, at the same table where Selby had died. Some truths require the repetition of circumstance. I said little at first. The sound of cutlery against porcelain filled the gaps where friendship used to be. When at last I spoke, it was not an accusation, but a reflection. I told them of Selby's final act, how the poison had not come from any of them, but from his own hand. The words drifted through the room without resistance. No one moved, though Bryce's spoon fell, clattering once against his plate before rolling to the floor. Selby had written his confession, not in words but in patterns, I continued. The misquoted grace, the altered hymn, the coded poem, each a fragment of farewell disguised as scholarship. He had chosen his death as carefully as one of his essays measured, annotated, tragically precise. It was Margaret who broke the silence. "Why tell us this?" she asked. her voice brittle, almost relieved. "Because," I said, "the living require absolution more than the dead." Her gaze shifted to Dor, who had not moved since the first sentence. He stared down at his glass, the candlelight trembling inside it. The wine remained untouched as Selby's had been. Bryce began to speak, though what came out was not quite confession. He spoke of the trust, of the years of quiet compromise that had held the college together. He admitted in halting fragments that funds had been misused, that Selby had discovered it, and that they had all chosen silence not from greed, but from fatigue. I told him that silence, like any indulgence, grows addictive. He did not disagree. When I turned to Dor, he met my gaze at last. His voice was low, deliberate. He said he had tried to protect the college, to preserve what little dignity remained. Selby, he claimed, had been determined to destroy it or himself. Perhaps both. There was no malice in his tone, only resignation. At that moment, I almost pitied him. Institutions demand sacrifices, and men like Dor mistake themselves for the altar. I asked about Eleanor. Vane's eyes flickered and Dor's jaw tightened. She had gone north, they said, to start over. I doubted she would. Oxford does not easily release those who have served its secrets. As the evening waned, I let the silence settle. The sound of rain began to creep against the high windows, soft but insistent. I told them that Selby had not sought revenge, only understanding. He had left his clues not to condemn, but to ensure that what he loved would be forced to look at itself. In that sense, perhaps, he had succeeded. No one spoke after that. Bryce refilled his glass, but did not drink. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, as if listening to some distant echo. Dor remained motionless, the line of his shoulders betraying the weight of unspoken years. I felt absurdly, like a priest at the end of a service no one believed in. When they finally dispersed, I lingered by the long table. The candles had burned down to fragile spines of wax. One of the glasses caught the light and reflected it faintly onto the far wall, a small, wavering flame. I thought of Selby's phrase, the one hidden in his ciphered hymn. A brighter flame burns beneath. Perhaps he had meant the truth itself, or perhaps only the persistence of guilt. Lewis and I left together. Outside, the quadrangle glistened with rain, and the sound of the chapel bell drifted across the stone. He asked whether I thought they would ever speak of that night again. I told him no. Some confessions, once heard, become their own silence. Back in my room, I poured a final whiskey and set it beside the crossword I'd left unfinished. The clue I'd been staring at for days read, "Faith's quiet companion, 5. I filled in the answer before I could stop myself. In Oxford, it always fits. I remember that night as one remembers a painting rather than an event. Something fixed, silent, slightly unreal. The rain had ceased by the time I reached my rooms, though the scent of it still clung to the window frames. Oxford, when emptied of sound, becomes an accomplice to thought. I poured a whiskey and watched the glass gather the lamplight until it seemed to contain its own small sun. The case, if it could be called that, was over. Papers had been filed, statements concluded, reputations cautiously preserved. The college would recover, as it always does, by rewriting its shame into footnotes. Yet Selby remained not as a ghost exactly, but as a question that refused its answer. Some men die for truth, others die merely to remind us that it still exists. Lewis had called earlier, his voice brisk with relief. He said it was good to have closure. I let him keep his word. Closure is for those who sleep easily. I told him to take a few days, visit his family. He laughed, said I sounded almost cheerful. When he hung up, the silence returned, heavier than before. I thought of Eleanor, then her careful stillness, the way she had looked beyond me rather than at me. Perhaps she understood Selby more than any of us. People like her rarely seek absolution. They learn instead to live beside their guilt, like lodgers who never quite unpack. On the desk lay the crossword from that morning, still unfinished. One clue remained, a word that endures when reason fails. 4. I stared at it for a long while, then left it blank. Some answers diminish when written down. Outside, the bells of St. Mary's struck the hour, their sound carrying across the spires like something half-remembered. I imagined Selby hearing the same bells years before, perhaps while drafting one of his essays on moral philosophy, a man so intent on defining conscience that he finally tested its limits upon himself. I finished my drink and let the room dim. Beyond the glass, the city glowed faintly under a film of mist, every window a small confession flickering against the dark. For a moment, I envied that quiet persistence of light. Then I turned away. Oxford would sleep, and I, as ever, would not.